Rabbi, in your video about the book of Revelation 666 to be particular, you said there was a variant that read 616 rather. How do we know what the author actually wrote? How do we find out what the author actually wrote? We can use textual criticism to try to find out what may have gone back to the author. Let me explain textual criticism for a bit and then answer your question. When performing textual criticism, one tries to determine the wording of the original text of a particular document when that original document no longer exists. If the original text of a document still exists, then textual criticism would not be necessary. We do have a discipline of Old Testament and New Testament studies called textual criticism because we do not have original copies, what scholars call autographs. The objective of New Testament or Old Testament textual criticism is to examine the copies of the autographs to try to get back to its original wording. This discipline, I believe, especially with New Testament textual criticism, I believe has also somewhat evolved and have been redefined to discover what scribes have changed in the text over the centuries and what those changes indicate about their cultural, political, socio-economic, and religious backgrounds. This plays a very important role in the transmission of the text. Now, there are two aspects of doing textual criticism. First, we have the external evidence, and second, we have the internal evidence. To answer your question, I will focus on the internal evidence, and my focus will be on the New Testament. The internal evidence has two elements. The first element is the intrinsic. It is what the author likely had written. And then the second element is the transcriptional. It is what the scribe or scribes likely had written when copying their exemplar. How do we determine what the author likely had written was your question. We can look at or see from places where the text is really stable. We can look at what an author's style is, and we can look at the narrative art, syntax, vocabulary, idioms, context, etc. Let's look at context with this example. Context matters in determining the correct reading. Let's take, for example, the woman caught in adultery. We see this in John chapter 7, verses 53. It goes all the way to John 8, verses 1 through 11. These are 12 verses altogether. Most of the manuscripts of the first millennium do not have the story. These 12 verses were absent from most of the manuscripts of the first millennium. The vast majority of New Testament textual critics have already recognized that this was most likely added later by scribes. These verses actually ends in 3 different places in the book of John. It is what we call a floating text that goes in a number of different directions. If one reads these 12 verses in the Greek, the reader is struck by the difference in the sound, texture, and quality of those 12 verses. Something is different, the reader notices. It does not read and sound like the John the reader had been reading all along. The quality and consistency of the text changes and then picks up after these 12 verses. That is why the vast majority of scholars that have produced Bible translations in the 20th and 21st centuries contend that they do not believe these 12 verses were part of what John originally wrote. The vocabulary, syntax, style, context, and idioms do not seem to match the rest of John's gospel very well. So this is using the context to determine the textual problem. Sometimes we can use writing style, the author's writing style. I'll give you an example of that too. We know that John, in his gospel, do not like calling Jesus Lord until after his resurrection. Consequently, when the reader looks at John 4 verses 1, the reader finds a textual problem there. This is what we read. When therefore Jesus knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. Other manuscripts have it as, when therefore the Lord knew. So we have when Jesus knew, and then when the Lord knew. Now, the meaning is not the issue here, but rather John's style. For the time that John narrates who Jesus is, before his resurrection, we notice that he calls him Jesus and in other terms. He does not typically use the word Lord. After the resurrection, this is when John starts to frequently use the word Lord. So here we have a scribe who changes the word Jesus to Lord. Now, the majority of manuscripts have the word Lord, while many of the early manuscripts have Jesus. Just because they are early does not mean that they are correct. We therefore use the writing style of John to determine the textual problem. This is how you can use the author's style to determine it. Now, these are not new problems. Not at all. Scholars have logged thousands of hours trying to determine the correct read, trying to find out what is authentic and what is not by going through all the evidence, external and then internal. Like I said, these are not new problems at all. This is something that was actually taught in school. To answer your question on the book of Revelations, the number of the beast, 666 or 616. Let's get a little background on this. There are 4 categories of New Testament variants. We have variants that are both meaningful and viable, meaning that it affects or changes the meaning of the text to some degree and has the possibility of going back to the original. We have variants that are neither meaningful nor viable. We have variants that are not meaningful but viable. And then we have variants that are not viable but meaningful. These 4 categories that I have mentioned, the number of the beast will fall under the meaningful and viable category. It does affect or change the meaning of the text to some degree, but it also has the possibility of reverting to the original. In Revelations 13:18, we read that the number of the beast is 666. In the Biblioteca Nacional in Paris, there is a 5th century manuscript that is probably our second most important manuscript for the book of Revelation. It asserts that the number of the beast is 616. With just one manuscript in support, it did not seem to have much plausibility, except that the 1st century church father Irenaeus spoke specifically about this textual variant. He said the best manuscript that he had seen was the one containing the 666, but there were some that had 616, meaning that the number 616 existed in the 2nd century. We know this because Irenaeus wrote about it during the late 2nd century. Until a few years ago, this was the only manuscript we had which read 616. Since then, another manuscript was excavated, which will be our earliest fragment of the book of Revelations, dated around the 3rd to 4th century. This manuscript contains the number of the beast as 616, just as the one in Paris. So when it comes to the 616 variant in the book of Revelations as the number of the beast, we have P115, we have Codex C, and then we have Irenaeus as references. So which one goes back to the autograph? Which one goes back to the original? Which one did the author write? I have no clue, but I still subscribe that it points to Nero and not a figure coming in the future.